Go back to single star. The sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, is true at all worlds in which no sentence tokens exist. Indeed, it would be bizarre if the proposition actually expressed by the sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, were true in a possible world, but that this did not explain why the sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, were true at that world. Conversely, I think that if the proposition actually expressed by the sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, is not true in a world, then the sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, is not true at that world. I think that all of this illustrates the following general point. For any sentence token T that actually expresses a proposition P, T is true at a world if and only if P is true in that world. With all this in mind, return to X. That Plantinga does not exist. That proposition is true at all worlds in which Plantinga does not exist. X is true if and only if the following is true. X star, this is on your handout. The sentence token, that Plantinga does not exist, is true at all worlds in which Plantinga does not exist. So X materially implies X star, just if and only if there's no box out in front. It materially implies X star, and given our above general point, X star implies that the proposition that Plantinga does not exist is true in all worlds in which OW does not exist. Thus, X star implies 2. Necessarily, if Plantinga does not exist, then that Plantinga does not exist is true. And that was the premise that truth at a world was supposed to somehow undermine. So X implies X star, which in turn implies 2. So in light of X, I conclude that 2 is true. But this isn't the main reason to accept 2. The main reason is the nature of truth. Consider these well-known lines from Aristotle's Metaphysics. Thus we define what the true and the false are. To say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false, while to say of what it is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true. I take Aristotle's definition of the true here to gesture at the following series of biconditionals. The proposition that dogs bark is true if and only if dogs bark. The proposition that the name Wilhelmina Lena Bossenbrook denotes exactly one object is true, just in case the name Wilhelmina Lena Bossenbrook denotes exactly one object. The proposition that Plantinga does not exist is true if and only if Plantinga does not exist, and so on. And I think that Aristotle's definition is correct, at least to this extent. Whatever else we know about the nature of truth, we know that it guarantees that biconditionals like these are in fact true. So biconditionals like these are true because of the nature of truth. Truth does not have its nature contingently, that's a premise. So biconditionals like these are not contingently true. Instead, they're necessarily true. And so the following biconditional is necessarily true. The proposition that Plantinga does not exist is true if and only if Plantinga does not exist. Because that biconditional is necessarily true, the following is true, and this is Roman numeral 2 plus on your handout. Necessarily, that Plantinga does not exist is true if and only if Plantinga does not exist. And obviously 2 plus entails 2. Necessarily, if Plantinga does not exist, then the proposition that Plantinga does not exist is true. So I say 2 is true because of the nature of truth itself. Okay, into that section. All right, section 5, objections pertaining to serious actualism. The received view implies that each negative existential singular proposition has the relevant individual as a constituent. Nathan Salmon endorses this implication of the received view. Salmon also thinks that a proposition exists only if its constituents exist. He then goes on to say, and here's a quote, Socrates is long gone, consequently singular propositions about him, which once existed, also no longer exist. Let us call the no longer existing proposition that Socrates does not exist Soc. Soc's present lack of existence does not prevent it from being presently true. Elsewhere, Salmon adds, quote, for any possible individual X, the possible singular proposition to the effect that X does not exist is necessarily such that if it is true, it does not exist. Its truth entails its non-existence. So Salmon thinks that a proposition can be true even if that proposition does not exist. So do Scott Soames and John Pollock and others. Obviously, these philosophers would deny crucial premise in each of the previous arguments. And one of them was called for, another D. If a proposition is true, then that proposition exists. The last argument was Roman numeral 4. Necessarily, if a proposition is true, then that proposition exists. As a result, these philosophers would reject all 3 of my arguments above. Serious actualism is the claim that necessarily an object exemplifies a property or stands in a relation only if that object exists. Salmon rejects serious actualism. But serious actualism was first articulated and defended by Alvin Plantinga. Therefore, we should accept serious actualism. And I do accept it. Moreover, I claim that necessarily a proposition is true if and only if that proposition exemplifies the property of being true. These two claims imply the truth of 4D and Roman numeral 4, so I conclude that 4D and Roman numeral 4 are all true. So serious actualism supports the three premises, the ones I just mentioned, and thereby supports my three above arguments against the received view. But serious actualism also at least suggests the following objection to two of those arguments, the first two. Here's the objection. Given serious actualism, the term no man and the term Lincoln do not refer to anything. So we cannot make claims about any individuals using those names. Two of my above arguments succeed only if we can and do make such claims, so those arguments fail. That's the objection. It says you can't refer to them because to refer would be to stand in a relation, blah, blah, blah. All right, my reply to this objection begins by considering a sadly impoverished world, possible world, one in which Alvin Plantinga does not exist. In that world, Al, being non-existent, is not the referent of Plantinga. But given the premises of Section 4's main argument, the singular proposition that Plantinga does not exist exists in that world. And if it exists, notice that argument, the possible one, that's not threatened by serious actualism. And if it exists in that world, serious actualism does not preclude its being expressed in that world. Similarly, if that proposition exists in that world, serious actualism does not preclude its being used in an argument in that world. Now, some might object that serious actualism aside, no one in a world in which Al does not exist could grasp the proposition that Plantinga does not exist, much less express it and then use it in an argument. But this objection is mistaken. The sperm S star and egg E star, whose union actually produced Alvin Plantinga, exist not only in the actual world, but also in some world W in which Al does not exist. So suppose that in W, if F star and E star had been united, Al would have been the result. Then philosophers in W could say, quote, let non-man be whoever would have resulted from the union of S star and E star. Then these philosophers could say, quote, non-man does not exist, thereby expressing the proposition that Plantinga does not exist. If they were especially clever, these philosophers would then use that proposition in an argument against the received view. So let us return then to serious actualism. Serious actualism implies that in worlds in which Al does not exist, the name Plantinga does not refer to him. But I claim that this implication does not preclude the existence or use in worlds in which Plantinga does not exist of the proposition that Plantinga does not exist. This claim is perhaps fairly unsurprising, but everyone who agrees with this claim should also endorse a somewhat more surprising parallel claim. It is that serious actualism's implication that the terms Lincoln and no man do not refer to anything does not preclude the existence or use of singular propositions like that Lincoln does not exist or that no man does not exist. My earlier arguments do not require no man or Lincoln to be the reference of names. Instead, they require only that we can use singular propositions such as that Lincoln does not exist, that no man does not exist, that no man would have been the result of the union of S and E. And if those singular propositions actually exist, then serious actualism does not preclude their use. So unless serious actualism precludes their, you guys are reading, aren't you? So unless serious actualism precludes the very existence of those singular propositions, it poses no threat to my above arguments. Alas, some think that serious actualism does preclude the very existence of singular propositions about non-existent entities. Here's Robert Adams. Quote, a serious actualist must deny that there are singular he actually said actualist, but he meant serious actualist. A serious actualist must deny that there are singular propositions about non-actual individuals. A singular proposition about an individual X is a proposition that involves or refers to X directly, and not by way of X's qualitative properties or relations to another individual. But according to serious actualism, a proposition cannot bear such a relation to any non-actual individual. Recall that Plantinga uses the expression directly about to characterize the way in which a singular proposition is about the relevant entity. Using Plantinga's terminology, we could put Adams's argument as follows. A proposition's being directly about an entity implies that that proposition stands in a relation to that entity. Given serious actualism, a proposition cannot be related to an entity that does not exist. Thus, a proposition cannot be directly about a non-existent entity. Thus, there cannot be singular propositions about non-existent entities. And here's Timothy Williamson. Quote, a proposition about an item exists only if that item exists. How could something be the proposition that that dog is barking in circumstances in which that dog does not exist? For to be the proposition that that dog is barking is to have a certain relation to that dog, which requires there to be such an item as that dog to which to have the relation. The argument is quite general. Williamson's argument expressed in